Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Ogi Ogas, the author of this new book, Journey of the Mind, How Thinking Emerged from Chaos. This is a very interesting book from a very interesting guy. Ogi was the Department of Homeland Security Fellow at the Department of Cognitive and Neural Systems at Boston University and a research fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He co-authored Dark Horse, The End of Average, and Shrinks, which was longlisted for the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. His new book traces the idea of the evolution of mind, thinking, and consciousness from molecules all the way to big brains and actually even beyond that, superminds, that is to say, societies, civilization. Societies, the internet, and so forth. So we start with discussing what exactly you mean by those words: mind, thinking, consciousness. We do address the hard problem of consciousness, which he thinks, and I think he's correct, just goes away when you explain from the bottom up how all these processes of dynamical systems operating between our sensory apparatus, stimulus coming in, and the processing of the information, and then responding to it behaviorally, going out, and that interacts with the environment. More information comes in kind of a dynamical system, which is what he means by chaos. He means chaos theory, these dynamical systems. So he goes from molecule minds like bacteria and amoeba to neuron minds like hydra, roundworms, flatworms, fly minds, and so on. Module minds like fish minds, frog minds, tortoise minds, rat minds, bird minds, monkey minds, and chimpanzee minds, and all the way to us, which he calls superminds. That is our own self-aware minds, and aware that we're aware, and theory of mind reading, and sapient superminds, which is civilization. Okay, so I push him on a lot of these metaphors. He claims they're not metaphors, that they're mathematically grounded, and that's all in the book. And then from there we pull out to talk about language, the origins of language, what language does, why it's special, the nature of the self, an inner life. I think I disagree with him on the idea that to have an inner life you need language. But in any case, you can hear the back and forth about that. And then free will and volition, and how that emerges from these dynamical systems, and from there the purpose of life and mind and consciousness in a universe that appears to be experiencing these kind of emergent properties of these dynamical systems becoming ever more complex. In other words, whether there's a God or not, there will be, and we will be it, something like that. Anyway, super interesting conversation. And if you appreciate the podcast, please do give us some support at skeptic.com/donate. The podcast is run by the Skeptic Society, a 501c3 nonprofit, so your donations there are tax deductible. And I thank you for listening. I finished your book last night, driving back from Chapman University. I teach this class, Skepticism 101, on Monday nights at Chapman University. It's a 144-mile drive each way. So it's a great way I can knock off an entire book usually in a day if I listen to it at 1.2 speed. So I got it dialed in. And and I loved your book, The Journey of the Mind. I'll have already introduced it properly, How Thinking Emerged from Chaos. You may have solved the consciousness problem, the so-called hard consciousness problem. Maybe. I've had a lot of guests on this show. I've read all those books. Yours is the best one that I've come across. It kind of scales up from molecules all the way up to big brains, bacteria to big brains. And but before we do that, the book is The Journey of the Mind. Let's start with your journey. Who are you? Where'd you come from? Where were you born and raised? Where'd you go to school? And how'd you get interested in this topic?
So I grew up in Maryland, though I've been in Boston now for about 30 years. So I certainly consider Boston my home. But I mean, my story, since I was a teenager, since I was 18, there was a particular moment. I've just been absolutely consumed with wanting to know about the human soul. Do we have a soul? What is the soul? How does it work? That was how I framed it back when I was a teenager. And that informed all of my studies and activities over the course of my life. Eventually, as I embrace science, I reframe the question as what is consciousness? What is mental activity? How do we experience meaning? How do we experience self-awareness? But definitely the thing that hooked me and that I've just spent my whole life, trying to find answers to is, what is this magical experience that we all have, that we often think of as our soul? And as you pointed out, I think finally, just over the past few years, there's an answer, a comprehensive answer, a scientific mathematical explanation of consciousness and self-awareness. For me, it is the explanation of the human soul. We can describe human subjective experience, our feelings, our knowledge, our ideas, all of this in clear physical and mathematical terms. And that's what I wrote the book with my co-author Sai Gadam. We want to share with everyone, especially people that do not have a math or science background. We want to help them understand these amazing mental phenomena, the mystery of self-awareness. How can we be aware of our own thoughts? It's amazing, and yet there's an answer to it. And so we wrote this book in order to give an easy to understand account that anybody can enjoy and make sense of. And it's an absolute adventure, we think, by taking readers on this journey of the mind. We start with the simplest minds and progress to the most sophisticated minds. But the reason we do this is to show how these sophisticated mental activities, the soul, how it actually works. Because by going through each mind, step by step, progressively more complicated, we can show the innovations that define each separate mind. So, this mind came up with this mental innovation that made it a bit smarter or a bit more aware than the previous mind. And in this way, we can, in a step-by-step, simple fashion, put together all the pieces that readers need to know in order to understand consciousness, which for me is finally an explanation of the human soul.
Right. So what does that word mean? Your youthful questioning of what is the soul? You are, like all of us, a natural-born dualist, as Paul Bloom likes to call us. That is, our intuition is that it feels like there's something else. There's body and mind. There's corporeal and incorporeal. There's body and soul, brain and mind, body and soul, corporeal and incorporeal. That's what it feels like instinctively, intuitively. And it takes a bit of effort to kind of get around that. There's no ghost in the machine, but it feels like there is. So how, was there some course in neuroscience you took or some discovery about neurons and how they operate that made you went, oh, okay, there is no ghost in the machine?
So the key, I guess, a fallacy, the key kind of pitfall that has deceived and duped so many scientists and scholars and philosophers over the years who study consciousness. It's actually simple to express. It's mistaking an activity for a thing. This is why it's been so hard to make progress with understanding consciousness, is because we keep thinking that this activity, because consciousness is an activity, the mind is an activity, treating it like a thing. This fallacy is not limited to the mind sciences. It's plagued all the sciences because it's part of the design of our mind. Our minds are designed to think about the world as objects, as things, as stuff. We have a harder time thinking about activity. For example, physicists, they used to think that heat was a substance called caloric. Chemists used to think that combustion, fire, was a substance called phlogiston. Biologists thought that life was caused by a substance called elan vital. So physicists, chemists, biologists, and psychologists, we all over and over keep making the same mistake. Now we know that heat is not caloric, it's the collective activity. It's the collective activity of all the molecules interacting. It's their kinetic energy. We know that combustion, also the collective activity of molecules. Life, the collective activity of cells. In each of these cases, it's many things interacting together collectively, holistically, that give rise to the phenomenon. And that was really the stumbling block all along with consciousness, because people throughout the history of trying to solve the mind-body problem, we're always looking for things. What Descartes looked for the pineal gland. More recently, Francis Crick thought that the claustrum, which is this really minor part of the brain, was where consciousness was produced, or looking for that magical energy. A lot of people have posited there's a special energy. Some philosophers even suggest that, consciousness is some fundamental element of the universe like charge and mass. But all of these are misguided approaches. It's simply a collective phenomenon. It's very much comparable to things like heat or life or combustion.
So to ask, where does the fire go when you blow it out, light a match, it doesn't go anywhere. It's just a process that it started and then it stopped. And that would be equivalent to saying, where does the soul go when you die?
So when we die, this is obviously a deep question that we all want to know about. What happens to ourself? Is there some essence of us that continues on after we die? So within the framework that we've laid out in Journey of the Mind, within this mathematical account of consciousness that we try to describe, what we would say is there is a kind of immortality, there is a kind of physical continuity, but it's not the kind that any of us probably are going to feel too terribly great about. But certainly there's not really any way to suggest that our memories, the I-ness, the me is going to continue on in some form. But what's important to keep in mind is that our individual minds, our individual souls, you could say, are really part of the human collective mind. We call it in the book a supermind, but our own minds cannot function without being a part of a community of minds. We cannot have thoughts. Language itself is the result of integrating this from the supermind, from the collective human experience. So who we are, the dynamics of our individuality, if we view the mind as activity, if we think consciousness is activity, our soul is activity, that activity goes out and joins the larger activity of all the other minds. So there's a very real sense, in a meaningful sense, in which we continue on after our body's death. But there's certainly not, at least as far as the evidence shows so far, that there's some individual continuity. Like there won't be some future where our memories and our will again emerges or takes place.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some compensation in imagining that we do live on through the entire human experience.
Compensation, by which you mean solace at the death of someone, and you think, well, they go on. I think also there's another element there that if you ask somebody, imagine yourself dead, you can't do it, because to imagine yourself, you're alive. So, people say, well, I see my body there in the casket. No, you're not going to see your body. Hopefully there's people there mourning. Well, you're not going to see anything because there's nothing to experience. So, I mean, the Jewish tradition, the older Jewish tradition about the afterlife is it's just nowhere. It's just nothing. You just cease to exist. Christians later added this place that you go to, and because it feels intuitively like the mind or soul floats off the brain and just goes off into the quantum field or whatever the latest theory about this is. But if I'm following your argument, and I agree with it, because I've always argued that the mind, this word, mind, consciousness, thinking, these are just words we're using to describe some process. But the tendency is to reify them into a thing, like yes. It's right there. There it is. It's located right there, and you can just kind of chunk it there. It's a thing that's floating there, but it's not. It's just a process. And I like the analogy of heat, fire. The Elan Vital is particularly fascinating because biologists were so obsessed with this. We're going to find this, and then what happened to that? It just kind of went away. People just quit talking about it once we understood the biochemistry and the molecular physiology of organs and the whole process of living organisms. People just quit looking for it, right? Something like that.
That's exactly it. I mean, once biologists started understanding the cell and the activity in the cell, and that life consists of lots of little processes, the processes of acquiring energy, excreting waste products, metabolism, reproduction, that each of these can be explained in terms of underlying mechanisms. And they eventually, biologists realized it's all of these processes together that gives rise to life. There's not some magical ingredient that's causing life. And it's exactly the same with consciousness. It's lots of things happening in our brain all at the same time, all over the place, that gives rise to it. Not one magical, there's not like a substance, there's not like a consciousness neuron or a consciousness brain structure that's responsible for it.
Right. So there's a little sidebar. You don't talk about this in your book, but I wrote about the search for the scientific search for immortality. If we could somehow like make a copy of your connectome, and we had every single synaptic connection between all 85 billion neurons and their 1,000 each connections, then you could basically upload the file into the cloud and turn it on, and there's you. I claim that that's not you because, and this is your argument, that the self is the point of view self. It's you from moment to moment to moment, looking out of your eyes, experiencing the world. And if you copy that, let's say you're not dead. Let's say you make a copy in a sophisticated MRI machine and upload it to the cloud and turn it on, and there you are, but they slide you out of the tube and you're still there. Now, what does that even mean? There's two of you? There's two selves? And at that moment, the two of you are going to have different life experiences, so now you're like twins or whatever. That without that continuity, there's no self, right? Something like that.
I'm so glad that you raised immortality, Michael, because this is one of the huge takeaways from what we've written in our book and this new understanding of consciousness, is that for the first time, we can talk rationally about immortality. And I'm so glad you described it the way you did, because usually what we think of kind of naively, what would immortality be like, we would reproduce our brain and, like you said, download it onto hardware. But the trick is, it's not reproducing the hardware. Like to achieve immortality, according to this view of consciousness in the mind that we describe in the book, it's not about reproducing the stuff, the things. It's reproducing the activity. So the activity needs to continue. So we need to find a way to transfer the activity somewhere. It's sort of like taking a hurricane that's in the Atlantic and somehow getting the hurricane over to the Pacific. That is the nature of the challenge. Very difficult, even more difficult than just reproducing the hardware. But at last, we can talk about it in a rational way. So that is the challenge. The challenge is, how do we get the activity in our mind to outside of our brain intact onto some other substrate? We can think how to do it. Are we anywhere close to that? No, not at all. Will any of us who's listening to this podcast live long enough? Almost certainly not. But is this something that we can imagine doing in a few hundred years, maybe 100 years? We can finally start thinking about that, in a reasonable, practical way.
Maybe, like Woody Allen said, I don't want to live on through my work. I want to live on in my apartment. It's that continuity from one moment to the next. If there's a break in it, well, let's think about this for a second. If you're chronically frozen and somehow they thaw you out and warm you up and you come alive like Frankenstein's monster, it seems like there would be a continuity, much like going under general anesthesia. You have no idea how long you've been out, an hour, 2 hours, whatever, who knows. And there's no dreaming like sleep. So it is something like that, but it'd be like you're out 100 years rather than 2 hours. If you woke up and your memories came back online, that seems like that would work.
So you make a very good point, very smart approach to the problem of immortality. But in that case, let's just say we're put to sleep, cryogenics, woken up. That certainly we can imagine that happening, but it would still, in a very real sense, be a continuation of the same activity. The activity would be slowed down immensely, but it would still be the same activity. If we reproduced the brain into something else, there would be a break in the activity. You'd have to jumpstart the activity, and the activity might end up being similar, but you would not be able to guarantee it's the same activity. So if it's just going to sleep, this is why when we go to sleep and we wake up, of course, when we wake up in the morning, we're not exactly the same. The activity in our brain when we wake up in the morning is not identical to the activity we had when we went to sleep, because our brain's changing. It's still during the night, there's more activity going on. The reason we sleep is because it recharges our batteries. It does some rewiring. It does some changes the neurotransmitters. It does a lot of physiological kind of housework when we're sleeping, but it's still activity. So even if we're frozen, there's going to be some continuous activity in the same substance, in the same place. But if you create two separate brains, that's the challenge. It's sort of like, another way of imagining it is like you build an identical copy of New York City somewhere with all the same physical stuff, but then to get it going, you need every person in the same spot and thinking the same thing at the same time to really it be the same city. So If it was you you're talking about and you want to make sure you're still you and the memories, that suddenly will become, very important. It seems like very abstract, but this is the nature of the problem. It's a lot like trying to reproduce. Let's say we want to reproduce New York City on the morning of September 11th, 2011. That is the nature of the challenge with
massive
download or
you would need
consciousness.
massive computing. I mean, because it's not just replicating your connectome; it's every single person and their bodies, because we're extended minds, and all the stuff that we're interacting with
Yes.
with each other in a physical environment. Impossible. I mean, this is there's this the simulation hypothesis. I just had David Chalmers on the podcast. He's got a whole book on this simulate that we may be living. There's a greater than 50% probability we're living in a simulation. And it's this kind of Bayesian argument that, the Copernican principle, we're not special, so there should be there should be intelligences ahead of us and behind us. We're in the middle. And if they're ahead of us, they should have created massively detailed virtual realities. And therefore, there's a greater than 50% probability we're living in one of those. And to me, this is now we're not even in science anymore. We're just science fiction, basically. But the idea. Go ahead.
I want to say, I can say with confidence, we are not living in a simulation.
Oh.
The entire, I know Elon Musk also believes that. So let me give you a scientific reason why we can disprove this. So that the whole notion of us living in a simulation is grounded in the idea that awareness, consciousness, the mind is like a computer program, that it's like an algorithm, that we can explain it in terms of information theory, computer science, or in terms of statistics. You mentioned Bayesian theory. These are not the correct math for explaining the mind. The mind does not operate based on statistics. It is not a Bayesian machine. If you accept the journey of the mind, our arguments in the book, and the mathematical view of consciousness as an activity, then it is not, the mathematics of statistics does not accurately describe its behavior. Neither does computer science. The reason these are the wrong mathematical frameworks for the mind, and then I'll explain why this shows that we're not living in a simulation. The reason these are the wrong approaches to the mind is because these forms of mathematics assume that there are, be a bit technical, then let me say the technical terms, and then I'll explain it in language anybody can understand. Both statistics and computer science would assume that our mind has fixed states that interact through fixed probabilities. An easier way of thinking that is computer science requires zeros and ones. It requires algorithms. The zeros and the ones are fixed. It's either a 0 or a 1, and then you process zeros and ones sequentially. That's what a computer program is. You process this instruction, then this instruction, and this instruction. You process these zeros, and then these ones, and then these zeros. That's the whole basis of this mathematical framework. This is not how the mind works. The mind is activity. There are no fixed states. The mind is constantly creating new states. A state in the mind, it could be a 0, it could be a 1, it could be a 0 and a 1 at the same time, it could be a half, it could be a 0.333, it could be something else entirely. Talking about them in terms of states or zeros and ones does not apply. Also, the probabilities, the way one state changes into another state, is constantly changing. Both statistics and computer science require that there's some kind of fixed probabilities, or that the probabilities of change in some rational, mathematically definable way. But again, the mind is constantly changing probabilities and states because it is activity. It's like looking at a hurricane. The mind is a lot more like a hurricane or a basketball game or a metropolis, a city, than a laptop or a computer. So the fallacy in thinking about when Chalmers or Elon Musk thinks about our existence as a simulation, they assume you can program this in some cosmic computer, but our minds are not computers. Our minds are not operating this way. It is constant activity. You couldn't simulate the universe because every piece of the universe has its own activity at the exact same time. It's not capturable. It's not renderable as zeros and ones, the way we would render, say, a Pixar movie or something like that. You can't, it's not transferable into statistics or
that's interesting.
Or zeros and ones.
Yeah, I've never heard that argument. That's a really good argument. But wouldn't the counter be that the brain is kind of Bayesian in how it does calculations? Let's just take a simple example. Let's say this pin here is a neuron, and it's connected to, through dendrites to like 1,000 other neurons. And does it fire or not to send the signal down the pathway? Well, it has some excitatory inputs from excitatory neurons, and it has some inhibitory inputs from inhibitory neurons, and it adds them up. And at some point, if there's enough on the positive than the negative, it fires and sends a signal down. And it depends on what the stimulation is. It's kind of a signal detection problem. Should I turn on or off based on what I think that thing is? In your simple examples in the book, it moves toward the light, or it moves away from the light, or it follows some chemical gradient, or it doesn't. And isn't that kind of a Bayesian probability? It's like almost like the neurons are doing calculations, although they're not conscious of this, but it's a
No,
chemical calculation. No?
you could model it. You could learn some things about it and model it with some level of accuracy using statistics. And a lot of people do use statistical models of neurons, exactly like you described. And that can get you some distance into understanding how the mind works and these activities work. But really, the neuron is a self-contained mind. The neuron is nonlinear. It is not a simple statistical calculation that is doing. It is doing the same dynamics that on a larger scale are happening in our brain. The dynamics of a neuron are the same as the dynamics in a single-celled creature, like a bacterium or an archaeon or a protozoa. Each of these have minds too, and their minds are not simple statistical mechanisms. When I say nonlinear, that means there's feedback loops that maybe one day, for your example of a neuron, there's inputs coming in. The same inputs on one that come into that neuron one day may have a completely different output on another day, simply because its internal dynamics have changed in the interim. A neuron is constantly taking in information, not just the simple signals, activation signals coming from other neurons. It's getting all kinds of neurochemical and biophysical information about things happening in different places, to processing it. The neuron on its own is a mind that is learning and changing. And so statistics is a decent model, but if you really want to get at what's actually happening under the hood in a deep way, then statistics cannot get you there. You need dynamic systems, a different kind of math.
You mean like chaos theory? That kind of dynamical mathematics? Yes. I see.
That's the direction. So it's sets of nonlinear equations. It's like the math to describe, say, a hurricane. It's much more in common with
yes. Okay.
With a neuron and thinking. This is the crux. So I'm glad you brought this up. I hope you'll allow me. The problem in the mind sciences and the brain behavioral sciences, since it was founded, is finding what is the right mathematics for understanding the mind. What is the right mathematical framework? And this is the reason that different schools of thought in the mind sciences are constantly coming and going. That Freudian psychoanalysis, behaviorism, cognitive science. And today, the two leading mathematical frameworks for understanding the mind are statistics and computer science, algorithm, looking at the mind as an algorithm. And there's a third mathematical framework, the one that we describe in the book, the one that we think is the right mathematical framework, which is dynamic systems. It's the math of change. It's the math of activity. Statistics and computer science are both static. They deal with fixed things. Programs, in a computer program, it doesn't matter how fast you run the program. You can run the same program on your iPhone or on a Commodore 64, an old computer that's really slow. It's the same program. But in an actual brain, time matters. The speed matters. Everything that happens in the brain is real time. So you need a mathematics of real time to accurately describe it. So if you're committed to the mathematics of statistics or committed to the mathematics of computer science, it's just going to drive the wrong intuitions about what's actually happening in the mind. You need a mathematics of dynamic systems that can naturally manage change in activity and lots of things happening all at the same time to get at it. And not many scientists have embraced that approach.
Right. So it seems to me you're employing just a different model or an analog or metaphor. I had Matthew Cobb on the show here last year with his book on the idea of the brain. And so it's like a history of metaphors used to explain the brain. We can't get inside there. I can't get inside your head. So we have to employ some kind of analog model metaphor to try to explain it. So maybe you're right. I like your argument.
Not a metaphor. Not a metaphor. It's math.
It's math. Okay.
It's not a metaphor. It's math. This is key. Like relativity. Relativity requires tensor mathematics, a particular kind of mathematics. It's sort of like a complicated vector mathematics. You can't explain relativity using statistics. It's just the wrong math. It doesn't get you there. Quantum physics also requires a specific kind of math. Requires math of probability and wave theory, wave function. It's a particular kind of math. If you try the mathematics of algorithms or computer science to explain quantum physics, it's just the wrong math. So these aren't metaphors. It's not that the right metaphor for relativity is tensor mathematics. No, tensor mathematics describes the actual physical activity. So taking a Bayesian approach to the mind is just wrong. It's another wrong approach. It's not going to get you the right answers. This is why it's easy to tell if somebody has a statistical approach to the mind, because they usually talk about consciousness as this baffling mystery that can't be solved, because you can't explain it with statistics. It doesn't make any sense. If that made sense, then the casino should be conscious. It's just processing statistics and probabilities. It's just the wrong framework.
Yes, but you used the word mind to describe a neuron. You said the neuron is itself its own mind. How is that possible, and even remotely like a whole brain of 85 billion neurons?
I'm glad you asked. So it has its own dynamics. So let me share one of the biggest takeaways from undertaking the journey of the mind. And this is just fascinating. This is new stuff. It's really interesting that in the journey of thinking on Earth, from the simplest minds 3 billion years ago, the very earliest minds, to the most sophisticated minds today, human civilization, our own brains, mammals, primates, that journey went through 4 specific stages, 4 well-defined and distinctive stages of thinking. I'll share the stages really quick and then talk about the transitions between the stages, because that's what the interesting part happens. So the simplest minds, we call the molecule minds. These are single-celled creatures, archaea, bacteria, protozoa, amoebas, little tiny creatures you need a microscope to see. Their minds are made of individually identifiable molecules. So those are the thinking elements. But those thinking elements still think through activity. There is molecular activity in each of these molecular minds that allows them to do things like navigate through complicated environments, find food, avoid toxins, possibly find other organisms to eat or other organisms to copulate with. Molecule minds, the simplest minds. The next stage of minds are the neuron minds, the thinking elements in neuron minds, which are creatures like jellyfish, worms, insects, basically all the invertebrates. They all have neurons as their thinking elements. And again, we have dynamics from neuron to neuron. But what's so interesting is these neuron to neuron dynamics are very, very similar to the molecule to molecule dynamics we saw in the molecule minds. The third stage of thinking are the vertebrate minds, fish, amphibians, mammals, birds, reptiles. All of these have thinking elements that are individual networks of neurons. We call them modules. So there'll be a module specialized for visual recognition, a module specialized for navigation. Those are the thinking elements, but those thinking elements, the modules, have dynamics, interactive dynamics similar to the neurons in the neuron minds and the molecules in the molecule minds. And finally, the fourth stage of thinking, there's only one member of this club, it's humans. We are in a supermind. Our individual brains are networked together. They're designed from the ground up to be networked together. They're like network routers. They can't function if there's a network of other minds around them. So our minds together form a collective supermind. Now, here's what's so fascinating and interesting about these transitions is that each of these transitions from one stage of thinking to the next is consistent and predictable. It always involves the need to solve a coordination problem, to have the thinking elements of the previous mind communicate with each other. It's easier to describe it. So the transition from molecule minds to neuron minds occurred when individual molecule minds, individual creatures, individual bacteria learned to communicate with each other. That was what led to neuron minds. Neurons are just single cells that have internal mental dynamics that are now interacting with each other. So here is the secret to intelligence on Earth in the journey of mind, is that each stage of mind is then embedded within the next stage. So we have molecule minds. Those are embedded within neurons, which then form neuron minds. The neurons are embedded within the module minds because Each individual module has its own internal dynamics. And then for us as humans, we are individual brains that are interacting with each other. And the way we all interact with each other is the same dynamics that we find in neurons interacting with each other and molecules interacting with each other. So we just keep adding new layers of thinking on top of the old layers of thinking all the way up.
Is it your sense that there's some inevitability to this process, or is it highly contingent? If you reran the tape on another planet, would it happen again or not? Or here, if you reran it here, not literally a read-only memory tape, but you just went back in time and started life again, would something like you and I be having a conversation like this?
Yes. Obviously, getting all the way to human superminds, there is a lot of contingencies. There's a lot of lucky breaks, but the pattern, the stages should always be the same. That's what's so remarkable about this, because each stage involves expanding the scope of reality that the mind can handle, expanding the scope of chaos that the mind can adapt to. So molecule minds, they are lost in an atomic tempest. They're dealing with Brownian motion, just individual atoms hitting them affects them. That's why bacteria, they don't go straight. They kind of go in this wiggly waggly motion all over the place because they're getting hit by molecules. To get out of that atomic tempest, the chaos at the molecular level, they had to get bigger. But to think bigger, they needed a whole new stage of mind. They needed a whole new stage of thinking. They needed neurons. But then for invertebrates, which are also tiny creatures, you can see some worms and insects with your eyes, but they're still tiny little creatures. To expand to process bigger things, rivers, trees, boulders, shorelines, things like that. Again, the mind had to expand its scope and scale. So to get to these new levels, these new scalings requires qualitative shift in thinking. So these stages are going to have to unfold in very similar fashion on any planet. And here's the other implication. There's no end to this. In fact, when we look around right now, we see the very beginning of the evolution to yet another stage of thinking where superminds are integrated with each other. What is the source of physical connectivity that's generating this? Because each time there's a transition, there's a new form of physical connectivity. Molecule minds communicated by molecular signals. Neurons, module minds communicate by representations. So how are superminds communicating? Over the internet. The internet has wired all superminds together and all individual human brains together. And all of this chaos that we're seeing in the world right now, the political chaos here in America, the hyperpolarization, obviously now there's this geopolitical chaos. On social media, there's so much hostility and rage, and it just seems like Wild Wild West. This is the early stages of figuring out how to establish a new stable stage of thinking. This is what it looked like all the previous times a new stage of thinking was coming into being. It's sort of this massive exploration for dynamics that it will stabilize. We're not there. That's why it's so chaotic, that we haven't worked out what these new dynamics will be. But at the end of this, hopefully there'll be a new stable state, but there's certainly nothing to guarantee that.
So minds interacting with other minds creates a supermind, and then superminds interacting via some substrate like the internet becomes Supermind 3 or whatever. This reminds me of, I don't know if you know Teilhard.
We call them hyperminds. But
hyperminds. I don't know if you know Teilhard de Chardin's work in the 1950s. He was a paleontologist and a deeply religious man, and his idea of the noosphere, N-O-O sphere, was something like, it was kind of a prophetic prediction of the internet, something like a supermind would arise on Earth. But he took this in kind of a religious direction. This is kind of like what God would be. This is what omniscience would be, where you have access to all the minds. You know what everything is. Something like that. And Frank Tipler took this in the 1990s even further. His book was The Physics of Immortality. And it's back to the simulation thing. He argued that in the far future, there will be virtual realities, real enough that they're indistinguishable from the reality you and I live in now. And that this far future omega point computer will have enough computing power to replicate everyone who ever lived. This is the resurrection. And so you and I and everybody else are all resurrected. And we're all living in this world, and we're brought back to life, essentially, virtually. But you can't tell, so who cares? and that's God, and it's all interconnected through this massive omega point computer. That's something like your it'd be a hyper super duper mind or something like that. Yeah, at this point now we're starting to bump up against almost theological ideas, which you play with a little bit at the end of your book.
Yeah, if I can say something about that, to maybe refine that model, because that Tipler's model, there is some truth to it, but there's some parts that maybe are mistaken. So the number one thing is all of these views are very human centric. We imagine we are the culmination of the journey of the mind, and what we show in the book is we were already surpassed. There's already another layer above us. The supermind. We imagine that we are the lords of creation, and that consciousness somehow was the peak of this. Consciousness is two major innovations in the past. There's been two more big innovations on top of it that are supermind innovations. So the journey of the mind's already past us. So, imagining that the future will hold ultimate virtual reality for us, that may be possible, but the universe doesn't care about us. I mean, the superminds might be like, hey, we superminds are going to get our own virtual reality. And then the hyperminds might think, well, we hyperminds, we're the ones that need the virtual reality. So imagining a future that's so human centric, it's probably not the right idea. And in fact, as you implied, if these minds keep growing, if this, we call it the Tandava. The Tandava is a term from the Hindu religion about this cosmic dance that Shiva does. It's sort of a dance of creation and destruction that defines the universe. So we think the universe's unfolding is dictated by this interaction of mind and chaos, of purpose and chaos. And what the journey of the mind suggests is that minds are going to keep expanding to new levels of reality, being able to adapt to new levels of chaos. There's no clear end to this process. It seems to be an iterative process that just keeps expanding. If this is the case, what we are doing with our lives is building future gods. We are constructing gods that will exist in the future. If we imagine, like you pointed out, that perhaps one day there'll be hyperminds, maybe hyperminds will join into an ultramind, these will certainly be godlike compared to our ability to manipulate the universe. And so there is a theological implication. I mean, there's a moral implication. The suggestion is, we should make our moral choices based on what kind of God we're bringing into being. If we act with love and compassion and kindness in our life, we're going to be building a God that is loving and kind. If we act selfishly with narrow views just out for ourselves, we're going to create a God that is selfish and cruel and domineering. So, it gives us agency and importance that, instead of saying God is this separate thing, that we should worship or comes down to us, it is our great privilege and responsibility to create the gods that will eventually arise in the universe. So it gives our actions and lives, a meaning.
It's like that sci-fi joke about the guy who asks the supercomputer, is there a God? And the answer comes back, there is now.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Create him.
Exactly.
Yes. But the way you talk about it still has a sense of inevitability to it. But you don't mean from the top down, like, or there's some front-loaded into the. So let me just back up. This idea of front-loading the laws of nature with kind of design into them is an intelligent design creationism argument. I get that. I don't think you're making that argument.
No.
It's more bottom up. Just a byproduct of the way the dynamical systems operate. It's pushing it
Yes.
in a way that's just kind of natural from the bottom up, not directing toward anything like there's a far future that we know is coming.
We know that if the same physical activity that has existed for the past 3 billion years in the journey of the mind, if that continues, and there's no reason to think it won't, it's sort of like saying, well, the laws of physics continue into the future. That's sort of what we're assuming. Then there'll be minds that jump through stages, but the character of those minds, the personality of those minds, hard to predict. But we know, for example, that they'll be able to think about a broader scale of reality. I can give a very specific, concrete example. Our human minds are designed to think about time in terms of Newtonian time. We think of it as a continuous, even, unvarying flow. That's built into the design of our brains. That's why we think of it that way. It's our brains are wired to think about time sequentially. But we know through science that time is actually relative. Einstein gave us that. But our supermind is learning to think in terms of relativity. Our supermind covers multiple time zones. It's locked into GPS. GPS is based on relativity. Even though we individually can't think about relativistic time, our supermind, in fact, does. Our America, the United States, conceives of time as relativistic. That's another way to think about these gods, too. Sort of what's going to be the future of the United States. Right now, we can imagine a future where the United States is freedom-loving, democratic, compassionate, but perhaps will end up being more autocratic, too. There's no certainty about what kind of country the United States is going to be, but we can have some confidence that the United States is going to maintain its stability indefinitely into the future. That whatever future dynamics unfold on the Earth, that will probably be around, but what will we be? That's kind of up to us.
I think your argument would appeal to Simon Conway Morris, the evolutionary theorist at Oxford I just had on the show. His thing is convergent evolution, that it's not as random and contingent as Steve Gould used to argue, and he clashed on this, and that certain things happen over and over, like eyes. Eyes have been reinvented, I don't know, several dozen times, and wings at least 3 times. And
wings.
There's only so many variations on a theme based on the physical environment that you're on, the kind of density of the air or water, the gravity of the planet you happen to live on, and so on. I think you're arguing kind of a convergent, in a kind of a convergent evolution, that evolution is going to unfold by these dynamical processes, not completely randomly or willy-nilly this way or that way, that there's going to kind of converge towards certain solutions to problems, which involve these molecule minds and the neuron minds and so forth.
It's a lot like the evolution of cities. Beijing is different than Boston, which is different from Sao Paulo, but they all have very similar dynamics. And, if I didn't know anything about cities in Australia, I can make some very concrete predictions about what we'll find if we look at cities in Australia or anywhere else, that there'll be roads and paths and, buildings and, some kind of governing body. There'll be people cleaning streets. There'll be people operating vehicles. There'll be people selling things, people buying things, people going to visit relations, people having entertainment. Like there's so many things we can predict about it because the dynamics are constrained by the physical reality that it operates in. And I absolutely think there is some convergent evolution in that sense in terms of the minds.
Oh, that's right. You referenced, I think, Jeffrey West's work on power laws in cities, right? That you can kind of predict how many restaurants there's going to be, scaling, how many gas stations there'll be, and how many hospitals there'll be based on the population size, just because that's how the system works most effectively. And there's nobody designing it from the top down, right? It just kind of evolves that way from the bottom up.
That's right. Self-organizes. It self-organizes that way. That's right. I mean, at its heart, the engine of this is minds are constantly trying to adapt to chaos. They're trying to adapt to reality. That is the nature of the mind. That is what it's always doing. It's trying to learn about reality so that it can do better next time, so it can stay alive and promote its interests. But this never stops. This is in the simplest mind. The very first mind was learning about its environment, was adapting to its environment. Human civilizations are learning about our environment and adapting to the environment. This is what we do. So to adapt to chaos always requires more entities. The more entities you have that are each interacting with reality in a slightly different way, that's how you build greater intelligence and greater autonomy.
Are you familiar with the cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman? His challenge to veridical perception. He says that's nonsense. We do not perceive reality. We did not evolve to perceive reality. We evolved just to get our genes in the next generation. And he has this whole metaphor of the laptop screen and that the little icons are like the ideas in our head. They don't actually exist there. These are just constructs we have to navigate the world and try to get our genes in the next generation. But the way you're arguing, and I agree with you, I think that there is veridical perception. Maybe not perfectly. We are deceived under certain conditions. But for the most part, in a natural environment, we get it right often enough that, let's say, whatever this configuration of my microphone and laptop looks like to a bat is surely different than what it looks like to me. But there really is a microphone and laptop there. The bat is really going to navigate around it because it's really there. And I'm going to navigate around it so I don't bump it because it's really there. So there is a kind of veridical perception to the whole the way you describe minds operating with the world.
Yeah, I would say the constructs are real. It's just they're an aspect of reality that we need to survive and do the things that we want to do, to adapt. So yeah, I'm not a fan of saying that we don't have vertical reality. I mean, there's a sense in which we're not directly interacting with reality, like the idea that what you see, what's landing on your retina is not a perfect representation, but it is a good, accurate, vertical representation. I mean, the whole reason we can even talk about being deceived, you mentioned that we can be fooled. The whole reason we can be fooled and be deceived and correctly say, you know what, you were deceived by that, you were fooled by that, you were tricked by that optical illusion, is because there's vertical perception. If we weren't connecting with something very real, then we wouldn't be able to even understand the notion of deception.
Yeah, I use the argument from camouflage and mimicry. This wouldn't work if there wasn't a real dangerous organism that looked like that that you're copying.
Exactly. And our vision systems are so great that we're pretty good at disentangling camouflage. But the consequence is that we're susceptible to deception and illusions. Our brains are susceptible to so many visual illusions. That's a consequence of getting it right on a very detailed way. The more accurate, the better you want to be at breaking camouflage, the more situations can lead to illusions too. That's the natural trade-off.
Yeah, I was lecturing on this last night to my class. I teach this class, Skepticism 101 at Chapman, and there's kind of a debate in cognitive circles about how rational or irrational humans are. And of course, my day job publishing Skeptic, there's a lot of irrationality that we debunk. But, and then you can grind through all the experiments by Tversky and Kahneman that show how irrational we are, and we make these really bad judgments. We use system one, rapid cognition, and we get it wrong over and over. But Gert Gingerenzer, the German cognitive psychologist, and Tooby and Cosmides here in Santa Barbara, they make the argument that you have to set these experiments up very carefully to trick subjects. You use these kind of logic puzzles. If P, then Q. If not P, then not Q. And at some point, eyes are glazing over like, P, Q, what the hell are you talking about? Turn over the card to see if it's a number or a letter, like what? That if you put it in a proper ecological environment that we evolved in, like say, who should you card at a bar if you're the bouncer, who you think is under 21 or that, or they're drinking alcohol, people usually get that right. And that most of those, like those illusions you see in Psych 101 textbooks, they work because they're designed based on how our perception really works, which is pretty good. It's amazing. We get it right most of the time. And you have to, like the impossible crate illusion, it has to be designed just carefully to trick you. And then my late friend, the magician, Jerry Andrus, actually made a 3D crate illusion. But it only works, he's standing inside this crate, that it only works when you photograph it from a particular angle. And if you photograph from another angle, you go, oh, well, I see exactly how it's done, like a magic trick. And so the only way magic trick, in fact, work is because magicians really know what our natural perceptions are like, and they're really good. So they have to go to great lengths, to like, they do this thing where, they look at the hand as they drop it like that, because they know that you're going to be following my gaze as I look at my hand, but the trick is over here in the other hand, right? But that takes a lot of practice to fool people. Otherwise, we're pretty good at it.
Exactly right. It's not easy to fool us. You have to work at it.
Yeah, and I was lecturing on cults also. And this idea that, we're so gullible. We're coming up here next week on the 25th anniversary of the Heaven's Gate cult, where these, the Hale-Bopp comet had the UFO behind it, and we're going to go, to the next level above humans, and they drank the equivalent of the Kool-Aid and went off to the UFO. 39 of them died. Okay. But, so it looks like humans are so dumb, so irrational. They join these crazy UFO cults, or they go with Jim Jones down to Guyana, or they join Scientology or whatever. But in fact, most people don't join cults. I mean, there's thousands, millions of social groups, clubs, all kinds of, self-help organizations, churches, sects, and so on. And most of them never lead to mass suicides, right? You have to only pick out maybe half a dozen that we all are aware of because they are so unusual. In fact, we're not that gullible. Most people don't have sex with the with the guru. Most people don't give up their life savings and put a second mortgage on their home. Most people don't do that. So, all right.
We have a strong tendency to go ahead.
Yeah, let me drill down on that. Just one last point on that thinking. I'm going to read to you from my book, The Believing Brain, from because you talked about behaviorism. So I was trained in a behavioral lab from Doug Navrick at Cal State Fullerton, and so he kind of Skinnerian philosophy. He writes, "I reject mentalistic explanations of behavior. In other words, attributing behavior to theoretical constructs that refer to internal states like understands, feels that, knows, gets it, figures out, wants, needs, believes, thinks, expects, pleasure, desire, etc., the reified concepts that students routinely use in their papers despite instructions that they'll lose points for doing so." And that, so even there, like you and I are talking about this, and you say, well, the molecular mind, again, this word mind, you must mean something different than thinking or different than consciousness.
So let me define. We define thinking in a very clear and specific way. So let me share this definition with you. But first, let me say, a good scientific definition is really just a good scientific model. And a good scientific model draws attention to what's most important about a phenomenon and getting rid of all the distracting or irrelevant details. But even more important, a good model should drive our intuitions so they can open up new avenues of research or new avenues of insight. So our definition of thinking, our definition of the activity of the mind, of any mind, is the conversion of sensory inputs from the environment into behavioral outputs that affect the environment in the service of a physical body, the body that the mind is embodied within. So converting sensory inputs into behavioral outputs in the service of the body. This might seem like a pretty simple or even trivial definition, but it's actually quite powerful because this simple definition can account for all biological minds on Earth, from bacteria all the way up to humans. It also can account for artificial intelligence minds. It can also encompass cities and countries as being conscious as well, being minds as well. And because the reason it captures these, the reason it unifies all minds into the single idea, the single concept, is because it expresses this loop. At the heart of every mind, bacteria, one day artificial intelligence, city, country, just our own individual mind, at the heart of every mind is a loop. It's a loop that goes from the environment into the mind and back out again. Sensory inputs come in, the mind processes it, it creates a behavior which goes to the output. That behavioral output then influences the next input. So it creates a loop. This loop is at the heart of every mind. So when we're talking about molecule minds, neuron minds, these different minds, each of them is converting sensory inputs into behavioral outputs through some kind of dynamics in the mind, and the output has to affect the physical body. And by affecting the physical body, it generates or influences the next set of inputs. It's a very simple idea, but very powerful, because it also emphasizes the mind as activity. It is the activity of converting inputs into outputs. It's this loop that never stops. This loop started 3 billion years ago, and it hasn't stopped. It's just looping, and it just keeps expanding the range of what it's looping through. The sensory inputs went from, simple molecular flotsam and jetsam, that down at the atomic level. Now we're looking at black holes, in galaxies on the other side of the universe. That's the sensory inputs we're getting, and we're not going to stop. We're going to keep pushing. This cycle keeps on going.
All right, let me see if I get this straight. So let me use another visual thing. I have this weird golf ball that I use for a magic trick. Anyway, let's just say this is a little amoeba, and it's bouncing around in its liquid medium from Brownian motion molecules, and then it senses like a chemical gradient that might be food. Well,
right.
Calories it needs. So it kind of moves off toward that, and there's also light there, but then there's a shadow and then I think, that might be a predator. So then it moves away from there, and all this is kind of a constant feedback loop. More information, and then it's processing. This is what you call thinking. And that this thing has a mind in the sense that it is in constant interaction with stimuli coming in, behavior going out. That changes the stimuli that comes in, that changes the behavior, and it's a never-ending feedback loop. Is that what you mean?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And the key is it's activity. It's activity. Like to focus on, say, the sensory molecule. I mean, it's helpful to understand it, but like it's not, the mind is not the sensory molecule. The mind is this constant interaction with the environment, which is generating new activity. So thinking about the mind in terms of that activity gives the best sense of what's actually going on in the mind. And what's so beautiful about this definition is that it unifies both simple, mundane forms of thinking, like pulling our hand away from a hot stove or distinguishing, red from blue. We kind of think, oh, these are probably have easy explanations. It's probably like an engineering problem. The same way we might explain how a toaster or a radio works, we can explain why I touch something hot, my hand jerks back. But we get a little more baffled and confused and intimidated when we think about things like consciousness and language. And most scientists and scholars have treated them as something separate, requiring a different kind of explanation than the mundane things. This is the source of, some people say, the hard problem. Consciousness is the hard problem, as opposed to the easy problem. Figuring out, reflexes, that's an easy problem. Distinguishing black from white, that's an easy problem. But consciousness is the hard problem. But our definition says there is no distinction. There is no hard problem. Consciousness is also activity. At bottom of this loop of inputs into outputs, it's the same fundamental activity, just way more sophisticated, way more complicated, but it's the same thinking. Consciousness, language, self-awareness, our experience of meaning, our experience of feelings of love and hate, all of these are still just the same fundamental dynamics as in the basic minds. It's a loop of activity, converting inputs into outputs for the benefit of the body, that just gets more and more and more sophisticated over time and has a much more, more and more expansive range of environmental inputs that it can process and behavioral outputs that it can generate.
Right. So we'll take my little amoeba here, and it's a prokaryotic cell, so super simple. And
I love your amoeba.
And we're made out of eukaryotic cells. So our cells have little organelles inside them that we think were once themselves independent cells. So this is, again, this kind of building from simple to complex and systems on top of systems all interacting. But at some point in your book, you make this leap from chimpanzees to humans, that chimps, you can put the red dot test, they're asleep, put a red dot on there, put a big mirror in front of them, and they kind of poke at it like, that's me, and that's not supposed to be there. This is so-called test of self-awareness. Not sure that's really what it's showing. And you can do this with elephants. They put a big blotch of white goop on their side, and then they look at it and they kind of poke at it with their tusk. And dolphins kind of sit there, and these are really interesting to do. You put this massive mirror in a tank, and the dolphin goes up to it, and you've put some white paint on the side or whatever they did. And I think you were skeptical of that, though, that test of self-awareness, or how would you know?
I love that you brought that up, because this test, the mirror test, helps show there's a fundamental difference between consciousness in animals, even consciousness in primates and monkeys and chimpanzees and gorillas, elephants. Consciousness in animals is different from human consciousness, because we have another innovation, another physical innovation on top of the dynamics of consciousness. We have the physical dynamics of language, and it is the interaction of the dynamics of language in our brain with the dynamics of consciousness, which all other animals have as well, that gives us our unique sense of self-awareness, of being aware of the self. And the reason the mirror test reveals this is that for an animal to become self-aware, it needs external help. It does not have this wired into its brain. If you put a mirror in front of it, it closes the loop. The mirror becomes a prosthetic version of what we have wired into our head. It's a physical manifestation of what we over time have got in our head. The way our own experience, what most people consider the hard problem, I hate that term, but most people consider the hard problem is, how am I aware of me? That I am aware of myself right now thinking thoughts. Ogi Ogas is thinking thoughts, and I'm aware of Ogi Ogas thinking thoughts. How can that be? That's usually considered the hard problem. That's different than asking, how is a chimpanzee aware of something? Chimpanzees are aware of things, but they are not aware of their own awareness because they lack language. They lack a separate reflector. We think about it as like a reflector of the self. If you put a mirror in front of them, they see themselves. It creates a dynamic loop. It's the same loop as in our brains. It's just in our brains, it's two layers of thinking, consciousness, and then a language layer built on top of that.
Yeah, you emphasize language pretty hard, but it seems to me much of my internal state of mind is not words. It's just, I don't know, images or feelings. That why do you need language?
We need language to become, first and foremost, we need language to interact with other human beings. So language is the physical connectivity of our brains to other brains. So language is really thinking at the supermind level. The same way thinking in our mind is neural activity, thinking in the supermind is language and other forms of communication. I mean, the internet now, for example, is an easy example, moving around. So language is thinking at the supermind level, and it is that supermind thinking interacting with our own consciousness that allows us to say I. So you gave examples. Hey, I have fragments of experience. I look at red and I experience, there's a redness. I hurt. Stick me with a pin. I feel pain. I'm aware of pain. That's the same kind of consciousness that animals have. So that's consciousness. But when you say, this is my pain, I am the one experiencing pain. I am the one that's looking at the color red. Once you're looking at yourself, once you're turning your attention to the source of the attention, that you need language to go through. And there's a simple mechanistic reason. The representation of yourself has to be outside of yourself. So a chimpanzee can't form a representation of itself because it's within the system, so to speak. You need another layer. You need a mirror. You need something else that you can then say, okay, I'll look at that mirror, and that mirror is the external representation. And language fulfills that role for us. Don't forget that the notion of self-awareness, the notion of the hard problem, is a very modern invention. Ancient Greeks weren't thinking about the consciousness problem. They weren't thinking about self-awareness. They had a very vague conception of a mind-body problem, but it's nothing like today because language hadn't yet caught up. It took time for us to develop words for thinking, feeling, the idea of having an inner life. I mean, we forget this, but the whole notion of an inner life and consciousness and unconsciousness was with Freud. Before Freud, there wasn't really any sense that there was an inner world to delve into. So just, these things we think about as our inner world are super modern, built out of language.
Can't I have an inner life without words? I mean, again, much of my inner life is just feelings, and I can visualize myself working out or whatever I'm doing. I'm getting out of my car. I'm going over to Starbucks. I'm not using words. I'm seeing things. Why do I need words for that? And there are people who don't have language. They have brain damage or whatever, and surely they have an internal self and a lived experience in there. No.
So let me say two things to that. First, I would disagree. There's pretty strong evidence that human children that are raised without language, and that's key, raised without language. If later you get brain damage, very different story. But if you raise a child without language, famous example is there's a young girl named Jeannie that was locked in a crib for, I think, 11 or 12 years without any human contact, never heard her human words spoken. Her father was psychotic. Whenever he interacted with her, he barked at her like a dog. There's other examples. There's a number of case studies of people without language. None of them grow up. Not only do they not grow up to have human interaction, they just simply can't interact with people. They can't even function alone. They can't take care of themselves in the most basic way. They always end up needing perpetual care for their entire life. And there's no evidence that they have any sense of the self. All the available evidence suggests language is necessary to form a self. Yeah. But the other thing too, if you look at the history of literature, the Greeks have a pretty rich literature. They weren't talking about inner lives. You don't see emotions. You see fate. They talk about fate, and knowing one's place in the world is knowing your social class, your social position. Beowulf, one of the oldest stories, it's basic human emotions, fear, anger, desire. Beowulf does not have an inner life. We don't start seeing inner life, even the notion of inner life, till Shakespeare. Shakespeare with Hamlet, to be or not to be. He's the first person that creates individual characters. Even the notion of individuality is really during the Renaissance, during Shakespeare's time. Look at Chaucer's, the different pilgrims. They're all stereotypes. They're not individually realized people. Even the Greek tragedies like Oedipus. Oedipus isn't a fully realized person. He's he's linked to his fate. His actions are predetermined by fate. So we weren't thinking about inner lives. We weren't expressing it. Artists had to invent it. We had to invent it through language.
Here you're talking about just the understanding or how we think about inner life. Surely people before Shakespeare had inner lives, or even before language. Maybe Neanderthals, but Neanderthals probably had language. Okay, so maybe go back to Homo erectus. Surely Homo erectus, who have pretty big brains, twice the size of chimps, had some kind of inner life, no?
I don't think so. If you mean interactivity, mental dynamics, then sure. Every creature has mental, furious mental dynamics are happening all the time. So an elephant, a chimpanzee, Neanderthals, they all had furious activity. But we're talking about awareness of the activity. Using language like, I want to be, this when I grow up. I want to be a plumber when I grow up. I am a person that I'm a foodie. I like to eat food. This is who I am. I like, I like to wear this kind of fashion. All of these things. No, I don't think those were present. Those required supermind thinking to generate. Our ability to talk about these things and conceive of these things requires an advanced enough supermind. Here's an easy way to think about it. If we keep going back in time, there were superminds all the way back. So there was Homo erectus superminds, Neanderthal superminds. Let's go back to the Neanderthal superminds. Let's go back to early Homo sapiens superminds. So keep it Homo sapiens, like 200,000 years ago. There was not yet words for thinking. There was not yet words for, boredom, complicated feelings and things like that. There couldn't have been. There needed time to invent them. So how could there have been an inner life if we didn't even have any way of expressing that or understanding that? It has to. This is the whole point of why you need these two layers. You need the consciousness layer. You need the layer of experience that all animals have, but you got to have some other layer that can represent those experiences. And that's what language gives us. Language is a platform for thinking about and talking about these experiences. A chimpanzee doesn't have an inner life because how would it communicate about it? How could it talk about it? How could it represent it in its own brain? Its brain is not designed to represent what's going on in its own brain.
I can envision how an internal combustion engine works. I can just see it, the pistons going up and down. I can describe it in words, but it's even more striking to me as an inner experience of seeing how it works. I don't need the words. I can see it. I don't even have to tell you about it. I can still understand it just by visualizing it. And then the second point, evolutionary psychologists study emotions, the evolution of emotion. So, like something like aggression, anger, jealousy, moral outrage, injustice. These are old internal states, inner lives of people feeling jealous when they're cuckolded, or angry or revengeful when somebody steals something from them. Even before there was words to describe it, those internal lives of feelings were surely there. No?
I think justice requires a fairly sophisticated supermind to have a concept of that. Sure, we all know what we like and don't like, and we have a sense of right and wrong, but that sense of right and wrong is usually determined by the supermind, especially if we go back to early peoples, Aboriginal tribes. There's a very tight, they believe in myths, in a shared myth, much more forcefully than we do today. But the notion of justice, it's really a supermind idea. That's why we celebrate Hammurabi's laws, for example. Like, that was a breakthrough because for the first time there was a conception that there was a sense of laws or justice that was over and above my own individual experience of interactions. And you gave the example of looking at pistons, but the whole idea of pistons, and the idea of learning about pistons is given to you by the supermind. A way to demonstrate what I'm getting at is the first human cities didn't have roads, they didn't have trails, they didn't have paths. The supermind had to create it. It wasn't obvious. Like all of these things that we think about, like how to understand a piston. This is all the furniture of the supermind that's given us. It's all language of the supermind. We imagine that we would have these experiences without language, but if you actually look at primitive peoples, Aboriginal peoples, they don't talk about the self and the inner life at all using the language that we do, and they don't talk about justice.
But how would you know
they do? They have a sense of right and wrong.
Okay, this gets to the other mind problem. How do you know that they don't have an inner life? You don't know that. You can't know that. All you can do is say, well, if they describe it in words, then I know that they have it. But if they don't, you don't know that they don't have it. You just don't know that they do.
I agree. There's some truth to that. But if our claim is that this awareness is a physical process, then we could, in principle, look at the physical activity in their brain, compare it to what we know about the activity in brains of people that are self-aware, modern humans, and we should be able to see the difference. I mean, we could even make some pretty good predictions about where in the brain we would expect different kinds of activity. But this is not an unsolvable problem. If mental activity is physical activity, then we should be able to figure it out. I wouldn't say that's easy, and I too would be highly skeptical of simple brain scans. All I'm saying is that this is an answerable question, and I would put my money on that we'll see that they are not aware of themselves.
All right.
It takes
here's
a
an
lot
example for you. Are you saying that Helen Keller had no inner life until her teacher taught her sign language?
I'd say her inner world. I don't know all the details about Helen Keller, but so I don't want to be specific to her, but if she, I believe she knew language. The reason I'm hedging is because I think she learned language before she was blind and deaf. So let's just imagine she was born blind and deaf, because I think that's getting at what you're trying to say. Then I'd say no, I don't think she had an inner life until someone taught her to communicate. Sign language or something, until somebody interacted with it. Yes, that is what I'm saying. I think Helen Keller herself actually had hearing for a period before she lost it. So she already did learn language.
I think that
so
was
she
very
already did have
young,
an inner life.
very young. I mean, she does describe...
That might have been, yeah. I don't want to speak specifically to her.
She does describe her epiphany of learning the letters, W-A-T-E-R, go with this stuff that's coming out of the spigot that she could feel with her hands, and what a revelation this was. Of course, she's describing this later when she can write and so forth, but that it was a revelation cognitively or experientially, probably would be a better way to say it. But I'm not sure she didn't experience feelings or maybe fear, anxiety about not being able to see and hear. And so again, back to let's say our Homo erectus sitting there with his coconuts, and Og comes over and steals one of them, and he's pissed, like, "Hey, that's mine." I mean, he can't say, "Hey, that's mine," sure. But he's angry. Yes. He's pissed off, like, and then he strikes back.
For sure, definitely.
And there's an aggression, right? I mean, this is the whole point of the evolution of aggression, and the sort of deterrence model of mutual assured destruction is all based on this idea that this is mine, that's yours. And that I know that you know that I know that. I mean, well, that gets to your kind of more reflective idea, but that sense of property, that has to be kind of incremental from the bottom up, like you're arguing.
What I'd say to that is, there's a difference between feeling angry and acting on the anger, which all humans do, even if you don't have language, and being aware, I am angry. That's the distinction. So yes, there's an inner life of anger and feelings, and even knowledge. I know this is a bottle. I can use this to drink. This will satisfy my thirst. But a difference between the experience and knowing I am experiencing. I am the one who's mad. I've been mad in the past. I have an angry personality. I know I have a tendency to get angry very easily. And I just punched this guy in the face. I know that's a problem with me. I'm always punching, and my wife is telling me I got to control that. Like that's a separate thing. That's a mental life that requires language. So just feeling anger, acting on that anger, having thoughts and ideas. So there is a mental world. I'm not saying there's no experience, not at all. There certainly is experience, and even animals have experience. It's just having what we humans would consider to be a mental life, a life of ideas, a life of an introspection. That requires language.
Right. Okay. So maybe if it's just another stage, the internal feelings are there, but adding words to them and then being able to talk about them maybe adds another layer. I just don't want language to be like this, and then a miracle happens. And that's why we're special and different from all other species, because your overall argument is that we're not special. It's incremental from the bottom up.
No. It's just a new layer of physical connectivity. language is physical connectivity, just like neurons communicating through signals and chemicals. That's a layer of physical connectivity. Our modules in our brain, like our visual module, our audio module, our navigation module, they communicate by representations, collections of signals. Our brains communicate with each other through language. So it's another layer of thinking. It's not like some magical thing. It's just a fourth layer of thinking. It's a fourth layer of connectivity that has evolved in minds here on Earth. And as we're saying, it seems to be a fifth layer of connectivity. The internet seems as a candidate for yet another layer of activity. It will be on top of human language. So the internet's on language, which is on top of consciousness, which is on top of representations, which is on top of neural signals, which is on top of molecular signals. So it's a stack of activity. And each new layer allows us, to adapt to the world, a little bit better.
So where does theory of mind reading come in? Where I know that you know, or I know that you know what I know, so therefore you're going to respond the way I respond, in that kind of meta loop sense. There's a famous experiment with a little box of crayons, and it says crayons on it, and you ask a 3-year-old what's in here, and they go, well, it's crayons. And then you open it up, and it's candles. And then you close it up, and then you bring Snoopy out from behind underneath the desk, and you say, okay, Snoopy's been sleeping. He doesn't know what's in here. What is Snoopy going to think is in this box? Oh, he's going to think it's candles. No, he doesn't know. So the curse of knowledge. But at age 4 or 5 or so, the kids go, oh, well, he's going to think it's crayons because that's what the box says. But you and I know that it's candles. And then, that's theory of mind. At some point, it comes online around age 4. When do you think this happened in our evolutionary history?
I wouldn't want to put a date to it, but I can talk about what would have probably been necessary. And really, the development of theory of mind is really more a function of the supermind than our own neural brain evolution. I'm sure there's some essential brain components too, but by far, it's that the supermind is learning about awareness. It's learning about minds and embedding that knowledge within, again, words, philosophy, stories of minds, ways of thinking about the mind, parents telling their kids, that giving them advice about understanding how objects work, teaching them about objects. All of these things contribute to our understanding of other minds. I mean, I know there's also been tests that, there's a relationship between the amount of education you've had and your ability to make predictions about other minds. There's good research on the more books you've read, the more novels you read, the better you are at understanding other people's minds, making predictions about how people will behave. It's a function, again, of supermind knowledge. So I think, if we're looking at when do we become aware of the internal life of other people and start making predictions about other people's internal life, it was a mutual development between, there must have been some neural evolution, some physical evolution, but I think the biggest piece was our superminds evolved to the point. Because we need to understand things like thinking, just the notion of thinking. It's invisible. What is it? You can't look at thinking. It has to be inferred. So how did we arrive with this concept of thinking? It has to arrive in a community of minds. There wasn't some genius that was sitting around the campfire and said, you know what? There's something happening in here. Let's call it thinking. And everybody said, oh yeah, let's call it thinking. It was a gradual process of communities. Probably there was some myth, probably originally told through myths. Maybe they were thinking about what God is saying, or what this God, the God of the tree or the God of the sun, how that God may have worked. Things like that may have contributed to it. But so I personally would put theory of mind as much as or more in supermind development as in physical.
Post language, then.
Yes, for sure.
And do you think there was?
I mean,
since we're riffing off on big topics, do you think there was an original Uber language, or no, not Uber? What's the right word? An original language that gave rise to all, or do you think there was multiple origins for language?
I don't think it makes a lot of sense to imagine there was one tribe somewhere that language began and that was the first language and then it spread out. I think because language is a form of connectivity, that it was just sort of bubbling up all over the place. So I think there was lots of humans in lots of different places all starting to speak proto-language. Probably gestures was almost certainly a big part of this. There was probably communicating through gestures and hand signals before there was words. But all of this, it was a big communal mess. It was very holistic. So yeah, I don't buy the idea that there was like some special privileged group of ancestral humans that started to talk, and those words were the foundation. There was probably early dominant languages. That makes some sense, especially if it's true that there was a time when most humans were in a certain place in Africa. I think it's conceivable that there might have been some basic widespread languages. But I think searching for the Uber language is probably a doomed venture. Searching for the Uber languages, or sort of like the Uber state of languages, I think is a better strategy.
Okay. The self. So if I followed your argument, that's something of an illusion in the sense that there's no thing up there called the self floating around, that it's part of the process. It's just my internal experience of myself from one moment to the next is me. That's always changing. But I still have a sense that there's kind of a fuzzy set. Like I kind of know who I am, and I know I'm different than I was when I was 10 years old or 25 or whatever. But there's still kind of a set of characteristics that in this set or this bin that I would say that's me, and it's kind of fluid and changing, but it's sort of a whole. Is that how you think of the self?
So we think of the self as the dynamics, the mental activity of the interaction between language and consciousness. So it's the dynamics of consciousness, which all animals have. I'm awareness of red, or recognizing this as a bottle. So that's consciousness activity. And on top of that is the language dynamics, which is the supermind activity. And it's these dynamics interacting with each other that produces self-awareness, that I am aware of myself. And you mentioned, hey, obviously I'm not the same physically or mentally as when I was 10 years old. And yet there's some things I can say that seem to be stable qualities that, I've always liked ice cream, maybe, or I've always liked sports. I always like being outdoors. I always have a combative personality, or I'm always an introvert. There's some things, these are dynamics. So these are mental dynamics. We become aware of those mental dynamics that are stable. Like, there's some preferences that are stable. Obviously, most things change though. And sometimes we think things are stable. We even might assert that they're stable when actually they've changed quite a bit and are changing. But yes, so self-awareness is sort of using language to stably represent our understanding of our own internal dynamics. And that's sort of like the physical basis of the self.
I think of things like the Big Five personality scale that has openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, disagreeableness, and neuroticism. We know from decades of research now that these are fairly stable over the lifetime. Give somebody the scale when they're 20, 30, 40, they vary a little bit. Of course, you can tweak your personality. It's not written in stone, but there's kind of, again, a fuzzy set we know you're kind of shy and this person's pretty extroverted. This person's very gregarious. This person's a little neurotic, is always upset about something. This person doesn't seem to ever get upset about anything. They're super stable. And that kind of carries through the lifetime, or you could use IQ scores or whatever. There are certain psychodynamic tools that we use that are pretty stable. They're predictable over a long period of time. I think of that as like, well, that's kind of your consistent self that is probably largely hardwired, maybe 50, 60% of it. Variance is accounted for by genes, and the rest, yes, you can tweak it by environment. But here, then, let's shift to free will and volition. The fact that I'm aware that I'm a little on the shy side, I can kind of nudge myself to go to the party, be a little more social. I don't really like being gregarious, but it's good for my character and it's good for my career if I'm a little more gregarious, so I'll push myself to do that. Well, who's doing that? Me. I am. I'm making that decision to do that. So to me, I think that's kind of volition. But as you know, determinists are they're pretty stubborn about this. It's a physical universe we live in. It's just parts moving around and energy. That's it. There's no ghost in the machine there's no little homunculus up there looking at the Cartesian, Dan Dennett's Cartesian theater going, oh, okay, now I'm going to do this. There's nothing like that. So how do you square that circle of we live in a determined universe and we have free will or volition or whatever it is we
we absolutely have the potential for free will. Free will is a fascinating physical phenomenon in the universe because it's one of the rare phenomena that only exists if you believe it exists. It requires a mind to believe in free will for free will to come into being. I'm not at all concerned about physicists' assertion that everything is deterministic. And here's why. It's simple. It's complexity. There's such a thing as emergence. I already described the 4 layers of thinking, molecule minds, neuron minds, module minds, superminds. Those are even sitting on other layers of physical activity. There's molecular activity, below that's atomic activity, below that's quantum activity. Each of these forms of activity are different. And just because you know all the quantum stuff is not going to let you make any predictions about what's happening at the human level. Like the idea that we can just look at all the quantum activity in our bodies and our brain, and we're going to know exactly what the next choice we're going to make. It's ridiculous. It's not physically accurate. To humans, because we have our own conscious layer interacting with the supermind layer, by interacting between multiple layers, that's what gives us the opportunity for free will. But it doesn't happen naturally. It requires a pretty advanced supermind. We need to think about ideas of free will, to discuss them. What is volition? The physicist discussion about that, because everything's atoms, everything's determined. That's another idea worth discussing as part of free will. It takes effort and awareness and education to learn about free will, to think about it, and to execute it. But that doesn't mean it's deterministic. It means that you're embracing, I have a level of activity. I can control activity at a certain level. I can't control everything. Most of the universe I can't control, and I certainly can't control the quantum stuff. But there is a layer, a prescribed region where I can act because I have control. I have control over a set of molecules in the universe. In my body right now, I can decide whatever I want. All the molecules in my body under my control. This isn't magic. This isn't theology. It's perfectly physical. It's just it's complexity and emergence. It's the benefit of having multiple layers on top of each other. The more layers you have, the greater free will, the greater potential for free will you can have. A country, the United States has the potential for greater capacity of free will than any individual human does. I mean, the United States could decide to destroy all life on Earth. Maybe I could want to do that, and then we wouldn't say, oh, we can reduce. It was predetermined that all life on Earth was going to be destroyed because the United States that day was going to launch, a nuclear strike. No, it's just silly to think about it. If you want to look at what's going to cause a nuclear strike, looking at the people and how they're going to interact and what the people believe and what the people are trying to do. That's how you get that answer, not by looking at, at protons and electrons.
Yes, I largely agree with you on that. I liked your argument I'm a compatibilist. I do think we do make volitional choices based along the lines of what I just argued. And also to add to that notion of the self, there's my current self and my future self. And I can envision my future self, say tomorrow or next week, being a little weak, like for chocolate ice cream, or I like chocolate. So my current self, when I go shopping, I'm going to make sure I've eaten something. So I'm not tempted when I get down there to buy the not so good food. So that's me being self-aware of my future weaknesses, because I can project myself and then tweaking the variables now kind of nudge myself down one pathway than another. I suppose the determinist would say, yeah, but even those impulses, Shermer, that you just had, those are determined by thoughts that came before those thoughts that came before those. Who knows where they come from? They just bubble up from underneath you in your limbic system or something. You have no control over that. And even when you say, I'm nudging myself, no, you're not. There's something physical system is nudging you. There's no homunculus up there making those decisions. How would you respond to something?
We are purposeful. Our minds are purposeful. We see things that aren't actually there. A unicorn, simple example, unicorn. There's no physicist can predict the existence of a unicorn. There are no unicorns. But I can imagine what a unicorn will look like. I can tell you how it will behave. I can fabricate things that there's mathematical objects like amoeba strip, that we can envision mathematical objects that make complete sense and we can describe them, but they could never exist in the physical world. Let's just base by our behavior upon these impossible things. I can conceive of some impossible philosophy entirely disconnected from physical reality and let that dictate what I do. I can say, okay, physicist, tell me what I'm going to do next, and then I'll do the opposite. And if you say, oh, well, if the physicist can't predict what I'm going to do, I mean, they got to make a prediction, right? They can't say I'm going to do the opposite. They have to say, am I going to do this or not do this? And then as soon as they make the prediction, I do the opposite. The reason this works, so this, it sounds like maybe there's some magic or some hand wave. No, it's because our minds, because their activity, the activity of the mind is separate from the physical activity of the universe. We can create activity that has its own structure and substance and nature that is not rooted in the physical activity that gave rise to it. Like a unicorn. The idea of a unicorn, of course, it's rooted in our brain, but it's not like I was looking out the window or studying the particles, electrons and protons, and said, oh, you know what? I bet a unicorn could arise. That requires creative effort. The activity of our mind creating something entirely new. So, do we have the ability to choose our own decisions? Is everything we choose based on some physical predetermination? No. Does it mean that everything is free for us to decide? No, of course we have all the constraints of physical reality. I mean, our free will is limited. It's not infinite. But right now, am I going to lift my right hand or left hand? That's under my control, because I'm very aware of the way, my mind and free will and the possibilities. It's possible to have more or less free will, like that. Hopefully, as we get more mature, and learn more about the world and learn more about outcomes and learn more about our own mind, and having discussions like this, on your wonderful show, like all of this, enhances our ability to have.
I like Dan Dennett's idea of degrees of freedom. Imagine. Systems have degrees of freedom. So you're a little amoeba bouncing around in the Brownian motion liquid. Has very few degrees of freedom. Go left, right, up, down, whatever. But it's nothing like the kind of options, say, a dog has versus and we have, and so on. It just scales up on an evolutionary scale. Again, let's not think of it as a black and white light switch, but more as a dimmer coming on, and more and more degrees of freedom. So volition would be kind of shades of gray of these degrees of freedom of choices that you may have, something like that. So I'm guessing you would argue the universe is not predetermined then. We don't know what's going to happen because we have some role in how it comes out.
Yes. This is, a big, I guess, if you wanted a spiritual or theological takeaway
let's go there.
From the journey of the mind, it is that we have a cosmic purpose in the universe. We are building the minds of the future. We are building gods. We have a role to play. One day, based on what we know about physics and now what we know about the evolution of the mind, the journey of the mind, there's no reason to believe that one day we will certainly try to take control over the universe. There's no doubt that minds will try to take over the universe. Is there going to be something to stop us or not? Physicists look at kind of the ultimate question of the universe: is the universe going to end in heat death? Is it going to collapse on itself? Is it oscillating? That's how physicists look at it. But they leave out the mind. They leave out thinking. They want to brush us aside. Of course, they want it to be deterministic. That way they can ignore mind science and behavioral science. They don't need to bother with consciousness and all this, the great math and science that's happening over here. They just want to kick it to the side. But no. Once you understand the mind and the journey of the mind and consciousness and will, the ultimate question in the universe is, will minds take over everything? Or is there going to be some physical limit or something that prevents us from taking over everything? And if we can take over everything, and it certainly doesn't look like there's any reason we can't, then what is our role? We are each meaningfully, through the actions we take, through the decisions we make, through who we decide to love, how much love we decide to give, or who we decide to, behave badly towards. All of this has a purpose towards creating these ultimate beings in the universe that one day may be jousting over ultimate control of all things. So I find it an invigorating view because it gives us a role, a meaningful role, but without denying, the physical reality that we all inhabit.
I like that a lot.
The problem with a lot of physicists' views of the world is it doesn't really...
Yeah, I like that a lot. Although I don't think you have to have the future mind building component to it. That's nice. But just the here and now, it matters now how we treat other people. I encountered this with William Lane Craig and some other theists who seem to stress that if the universe ends billions of years from now and there is no God, then none of this matters. You know, what Hitler did to the Jews doesn't matter because there is no cosmic courthouse to settle it all out in the end. But to me, this is what I call Alvey's error. Alvey is Alvey Singer, Woody Allen's character in Annie Hall, in which he has that flashback as a young child and he doesn't want to do his homework. And the psychiatrist says, why not? Because the universe is expanding. If the universe is expanding, then nothing is going to end one day and none of this matters. And his mother says, what's the universe got to do with it? We live in Brooklyn and Brooklyn's not expanding. So again, this kind of emphasis on the future, I think is fine, but don't forget it matters now. It matters to the Jews how Hitler treated them. It matters now how Russians are treating Ukrainians and so on. How we act with other people right here, right now, whether there's a God or not, whether there's an afterlife or not, who knows? No one knows for sure, but who cares? Now is what matters.
Michael, I couldn't agree more. I absolutely agree that we don't need to know what the future holds in store. And we don't even need to know what the universe is ultimately made of physically to choose to act good, to choose decency over hate and selfishness. I couldn't agree more. It's a happy surprise to see that the physical structure and dynamics of the universe seem to suggest a cosmic role for us as well. But you're right. Even if everything we see in the journey of the mind and our mathematical understanding of consciousness, even if our mathematical understanding of physics all turns out to be wrong, we should still act decently towards one another. It doesn't obviate the need for that at all. And it matters.
Yep. Perfect place to end the conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for your book. I don't know how you're going to top this because you've covered pretty much every big subject there is. But what's next on your plate? What are you working on?
My co-author, Cy, and I are already on our second book. It's a follow-up called Song of the Self. And it's a lot like Journey of the Mind. It's another journey, but we're taking a journey of the individual self from the womb all the way to death. So we're going to retrace the activity, the physical activity of the self through an entire individual life.
Oh my God, that's great. Oh, okay. Well, we'll have you back on the show when that one's done.